Okay, so today we're going to cover the partition question, which will come up as part of sovereignty and partition section of the course. And this question, as you can see, comes up repeatedly, 2026, 2010, 2017, and in a slightly different form. So we can see here from 1912 onwards what factors contributed to the partition of Ireland in 1920. During the period 1912-20, what factors contributed to the partition of Ireland, and during the period 1912 to 20, what factors contributed most to the partition of Ireland. So very little difference in the questions, but you can see that there's just a slight little difference in wording. All questions are worth 100 marks, okay, in your essay, and they'll be marked according to the mark scheme. Cumulative mark, 60 marks. Overall evaluation, 40 marks. Okay, so what I've done here is made a generic plan to answer all three questions that we looked at earlier. So when you see a slight variety in the question, maybe in the parameters of the question time-wise or the wording of the question, then you've revised the topic of partition and you can adapt your plan accordingly to the question. As we saw earlier on, there wasn't much of a difference between the different questions. So if I'm looking at this partition question, I'm starting off with an introduction. Now remember, I'm looking at partition of the country, the separation of the country into the 26 and the 6 counties that took place in 1920 at the Government of Ireland Act. And I'm going to go back to 1912. That's when the question asked me to start. So I'm actually going to go back a year beforehand for my introduction. I'm going to briefly explain the nationalist unionist dynamic in the country, which the British calls the Irish problem or the Irish question, which also became known as the Ulster question. So all of those are interchangeable terms that you could use in your answer. And the first mention of the solution to the Irish problem as partition was made by Thomas Agar Roberts in 1912 in the House of Commons. He was a Liberal MP from Cornwall, and he brought up partition as a possible solution to the problem. After that, it becomes the sort of unofficial solution, and then eventually it becomes the official solution, and of course it's with us to this day. Edward Carson, the leader of the Unionist Party, who was from the South, was originally against the breaking of the Union in any part of the country. In other words, he wanted the Union maintained and he was against Home Rule in any part of the country. But sometime around 1910, 11, 12, Carson became convinced that the only way that the Unionists could develop an effective strategy would be to concentrate on the north of Ireland and abandon the Unionists and the Protestants in the 26 counties, which he did. And he refers to this, responsible for the government of the Protestant province of Ulster, as early as 1911. So he's thinking in terms of partition too, it must be at this stage, or it's beginning to form in his mind. All right. This is later on what we'll call the Ulster nature of the opposition, which is in contrast to previous Home Rule bills of the 19th century, the 1885 Home Rule Bill, the 1892 Home Rule Bill, where the Unionist opposition was focused on against Home Rule in its entirety. Okay, so after our nice little introduction, then we'll move on to paragraph 1. And remember, of course, the structure of your essay to make all your paragraphs the same length, pretty much, okay? And the closing part of each paragraph, we focus back on what the question is asking you. So if we go to paragraph 1, we can see that the real issue comes to the fore in the years 1912 to 1914, and it's a gradual process. You will know from your history that in 1912 the Home Rule Bill is introduced to the House of Commons but fails in the House of Lords, and then the year later, 1913, it's reintroduced at second reading of the bill in the House of Commons. It fails in the House of Lords, and then in 1914, third reading of the Home Rule Bill in the House of Commons means it passes according to the Parliament Act of 1911. Okay, so try and get that into your answer without being too descriptive about what the Parliament Act is. You could just mention it, showing your in-depth knowledge of the British political system. And you see the gradual progress and how this crisis continues over 2 years, which allows the Unionists in the north of Ireland to organise their opposition, and the opposition had a lot of public support, as we can see by the Solemn League and Covenant, a petition gathering the names of 450,000 people, some of them signing in blood, of course, famously, And the Unionist Council, this organisation, to coordinate all the elements of unionists. So to be an effective opposition, they needed an organisation, and they were very well organised. And of course then we have the formation of the Ulster Volunteer Force. And the Ulster Volunteer Force is key to understanding the pressure. This is a pressure group, okay, to put pressure on the British government to stop Home Rule. Or to stop Home Rule for Ulster at least. Look at the name, Ulster Volunteer Force. And it was quite legal, okay, and it was very effective. Paragraph 2 then, I will focus on a bit of continuity, this idea of the Ulster nature of the opposition, which we've been talking about since the introduction. And this idea that they were looking for an opt-out of 9, 6 or 4 counties of the Home Rule Bill, okay? And then we can see the counter move made in the south of the island, the formation of the Irish Volunteer Force. So 2 volunteer forces, militias if you like, who were one opposed to Home Rule and one in favour of Home Rule, and both putting enormous pressure on the British Prime Minister Herbert Asquith. Right? Now, up to 1914, arms imports into Ireland were legal, so they began to arm themselves quite legally and import guns, which you need finance for. But in 1914, the British government banned all imports of weapons into Ireland because they believed that the situation could get out of control. And then we have the gun running from both sides. The gun running that takes place in Larne, Donaghadee and Bangor, which brings in rifles from the UVF, and of course the gun running at Holt in the south, which brings in arms for the IVF. So we have this situation developing and becoming worse, and the two sides becoming more polarised. The idea of compromise between the two sides is remote at this stage, and it becomes more remote with the events of 1914. So 1914, the crisis comes to a head. In April, the Home Rule Bill comes into law. And it's due to come into law in September. And this is critical. This really does need to be in your answer, this idea of the Curragh Mutiny. And the Curragh Mutiny was a letter sent by the British troops, the officers of the British troops in the Curragh in Kildare, saying that they would not enforce or take up arms against the Unionists in Northern Ireland, which basically left the British government in a very difficult position. If they were going to introduce Home Rule for the whole of the island, and if there was going to be opposition, who was going to implement it? And the army were saying no to this. So this is what's described as a mutiny. Now Asquith really didn't deal with the mutiny, perhaps because of the situation in Europe. Perhaps he was hoping for some sort of compromise, but the situation rumbled on. And then the king intervened. King George V, he called a conference in Buckingham Palace, and he invited the leaders of unionism, and he invited the leaders of nationalism, so Redmond and Carson, and then he invited the leader of the Conservative Party, Andrew Bonar Law, and then he invited the Prime Minister of Britain, Herbert Asquith, and he encouraged them. And it wasn't taken lightly, a king's request like that, to find a solution, but they couldn't find any solution. I mean, the unionists just kept on saying no to this, no to that, and that was very much what their propaganda was about, okay? And of course, this takes place in July, and in August we have international events overtaking the situation with the outbreak of World War I. So World War I really is a huge crisis for the British Empire, and everybody's puts that this is a greater crisis than the Home Rule crisis, and the IVF and the UVF both go to join up. Home Rule did become law in September, but it was put on ice, as they say, until after the war was over. Put it on ice until after the war was over, but there was a very, very interesting opt-out given to 6 counties that they could opt out of Home Rule for 6 years. So we can see, even before the break, if you like, in the Home Rule crisis, which is World War I, we have this opt-out of the 6 counties. So partition has become an official solution to the Irish problem, and that's going to continue in the period after the war. So that's a nice first half of the essay, if you like. And don't forget your key concepts: sovereignty and partition, Ulster unionism, physical force. Drop them in, okay? Drop them in a natural manner, not some sort of bolt-on thing, which looks, I know what a key concept is, because that doesn't really work. And the key people that deserve a mention in this essay if you want to mention people as well. That's always a good idea. Paragraph 4 then, we have the whole World War I experience, and I cannot stress how much that World War I altered European British society. It was really a very, very important event. Okay, and the UVF played their part, and they played their part, and the IVF played their part, but they were treated a little bit different by the British authorities. And nationalists would always say, and Republicans would always say, that there was the British state favoured the Unionists above the Irish Volunteers. You don't say that in your answer, of course. If you want to say that, you say nationalists claim. Okay. We have the Easter Rising in 1916, which was viewed as a heroic act in Ireland, which was viewed as a stab in the back in London. And it was associated with nationalism. Even though most of the IVF weren't involved, they were involved in World War I, the Easter Rising carried out by the IRB, suddenly public opinion began to change in favour of the rebels. The contrast with the UVF, which also in 1916 took part in the Battle of the Somme. And the Battle of the Somme was a huge disaster in British military history. The worst day and greatest mental losses in British military history. So the good news story was the UVF, the Ulster Volunteers, the loyal Ulster Volunteers had achieved their aims. And so British public opinion in the post-war period looked at the Unionists and their performance in World War I in a more favourable light than the Irish nationalist volunteers. Of course, they viewed them as potential traitors supporting this idea of the stab in the back. Okay, and that's important in perceptions, and perceptions are important for later on. When we get to paragraph 5 then, we're going to get into now the real move towards the solution to the Irish problem. And the 1998 general election is key in this. And we can see that change in public opinion that took place after 1916 and the breakthrough of this new separatist Republican Party, Sinn Féin, with 73 seats, nearly all of them in the 26 county areas. They got no seats in the northern part in the Ulster part of the country, apart from Donegal, Cavan around there. The Unionist Party got 26 seats, so they dominate the 4 counties of the northeast and other areas as well. And the Irish Parliamentary Party, 6 seats. So, a wipeout. They no longer are a force in Irish politics. So now we have the separatist Sinn Féin and the Ulster Unionists who want partition. Okay? The 73 members of Sinn Féin boycott the Dáil in a policy called abstention, and they set up their own Dáil Éireann in Ireland, and they begin to carry out a disruption of British policy in Ireland, direct action. There's a guerrilla campaign carried out by the IRA, and this is called the War of Independence, and the Dáil claims to be the legitimate government of Ireland. Lloyd George shuts down the Dáil, he makes it illegal, okay, and he refuses to recognise the legitimacy as the IRA as a political force. Instead he says he tries to criminalise the action, and so when we get into, we can see his policies, they vary quite a bit. In 1920, Lloyd George introduces an auxiliary police force called the Black and Tans, and the auxiliaries made up of ex-soldiers and ex-officers of the British Army, and he uses these to bolster the declining numbers of RIC police in Ireland and try and restore law and order. Of course, it doesn't really work, and the situation intensifies, it gets worse. There's some appalling atrocities like Bloody Sunday, which paints the British in a very bad light internationally. So Lloyd George's solution then to the Irish problem, his solution to the Irish problem was the Government of Ireland Act, and this recognised partition that we've been talking about all through this essay, the thread, if you like, through the essay. The Government of Ireland Act, and the Government of Ireland Act makes 2 parliaments. It gives home rule to Dublin and a 26 county Ireland, and it gives home rule to Belfast, 6 counties. So it creates 2 parliaments, and it creates also an Irish Council for cooperation between the Northern Parliament and the Southern Parliament. The Act sets that up right at the end of 1920. It's December 23rd, 1920 that this happens. And of course, the Unionists have got what they want. They've prevented home rule in Ireland, But they got home rule in Ulster for themselves, which is quite ironic, I suppose. This then comes into operation in 1921 when there's elections for the Belfast Parliament and elections for the Dublin Parliament. The elections for the Belfast Parliament mean that the Unionist Party of Carson, now the leader is Craig, they take power in Northern Ireland and they rule that 6 counties, that Stormont Parliament continues until 1972 when it's abolished in direct rule, which will be part of your Northern Ireland course. And in the south, Sinn Féin win 124 of the 128 seats for the Dublin Parliament, and they boycott it. Instead they set up the second Dáil and say we are the legitimate government of Ireland. So they continue that policy of abstention. But there is 2 Irelands at this stage and the island has been partitioned, and that remains the case. When, in your conclusion there, when the delegates of Sinn Féin, De Valera first of all, and then Griffith and Collins, go to London to sign the Anglo-Irish Treaty, negotiations signed the Anglo-Irish Treaty, they agreed partition. They agreed partition and an Irish Council. And they signed that, and so partition becomes official then between the 2 new states. The very, very closing part of your essay could refer to what happened to the Irish Council, but that really is outside the parameters of the question. But basically what happens is there's a boundary crisis in 1924 and 1925, and an Anglo-Irish agreement in 1925 which agrees to dismantle the Irish Council, and so partition becomes permanent.